Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I cannot see anybody. I can only see my screen, but hello. As you've already heard, I'm a Frontline Fellow. I started the programme in 2019, finished my Masters in 2021, qualified in 2020. I am a school-based social worker and I am at school today, so I apologise if at any point you hear any loud noises. I promise I'm safe, even though it might not sound like I am when the children are in the corridor sometimes. But yeah, here today to talk a little bit about how we can better talk to young people about sexuality and gender. So I'll just take you through the presentation now. So I had a few objectives that I sort of wanted to talk through today. The first one was to just talk a little bit about what my initial observations were when I started within the profession about how conversations about sexuality and gender were approached. And that sort of covers what encouraged me to pick the dissertation research topic that I did. The second objective was to actually talk about the research project that I did. So that was how can I comfortably and productively explore the topic of sexuality with young people and with their families as well. And then the third thing that I wanted to do was just talk a little bit about my learning from the project and ways that I've sort of incorporated what I learned into my practice following that. Then at the end, I'll do my best to answer any questions. Definitely a topic of interest, but also not an expert. So if there are any questions, sorry, that I'm not able to answer, it might be that I might be able to direct to somewhere or somebody that can, but will do my best to answer as many as possible. So as you had a bit of a background to me, there's another background here, a picture of me actually from the Summer Institute. I think I still look as fresh-faced but before I entered the profession here. Some extra information about me. So I identify as a Black British woman of Caribbean descent. I also identify as pansexual or bisexual, whatever is sort of an open definition, and or queer as well. Even though the focus isn't race, isn't ethnicity, I'm very big on intersectionality, as you'll sort of see from some of the resources that I've got at the end as well. And I do think that it's important whenever we think about anything, we may be sort of focusing on gender, sexuality and sexual orientation today, but actually other identity markers might also impact how we interact with other aspects of our identity too. Of course, it is really important to think about who we are and how we identify as well, because as practitioners, when we sort of come into families, our identities can also impact how we interact with them as well. Sort of what encouraged me to begin the topic, begin the project that I did. So thinking a bit more widely about sort of sexuality and gender, my project was focused on sexuality, but a lot of the things that I have sort of discussed and found can be applicable to conversations about gender as well. But I mean, first of all, sexuality is something that is very, very sort of natural. It's a natural part of us. Everybody has a sexuality. I think there's a big misconception that I talk a little bit about in my project, that a lot of people think that conversations around sexuality are reserved for people with queer identities, but actually, if you identify as heterosexual, that is a part of your sexual identity. Another thing that really sort of stood out to me, particularly when I was doing my research as well, is that sexual development is a key part of human development. We don't really think a lot about that when we do sort of child development, when we do development of adolescence. It's not really something that tends to come up. I've got sort of bits of research dotted on the screen throughout the presentation, but as we can see, Dodd said that infantile sexuality starts when infants start to explore their body parts. So we're sort of thinking about sort of the fact that this is a key part of our development from when we are very small. Again, it's often ignored. Another thing that I would say that I noticed pretty immediately actually when I got into my local authority, and it was also very clear when I began to do my reading, is that there is just a massive lack of conversations around gender and sexuality. I've sort of observed that within social work, but my reading said that within the wider sector of health and social care, there is sort of a massive lack of those conversations. And as you've got here, this study sort of stated that 60% of healthcare professionals said that sexual issues were important to be addressed, but only 6 of them actually said that they did discuss sexuality regularly. And then we've got that 40% gap of practitioners who didn't think it was sort of something that was important or should be addressed as part of their work. And that within itself, I suppose, raises questions. Sorry, has my slide? Oh, there we go. It's changed. Some personal observations as well. So personally, I felt that I didn't really receive any training around how to discuss sexuality or gender with young people. Even identifying as queer myself, that didn't really mean that I automatically knew how to approach these topics. I think having a queer identity is one thing, but knowing how to interact with queer young people is completely different. Knowing what to do as a professional, knowing how to support, in what ways you can support, was something that was a massive grey area for me when I started. I was also told, not by a member of Frontline, but by quite a prominent social work professional, that they felt that actually LGBTQ+ identities were not our issue. And that was probably one of the biggest driving forces for me as a student to pick this topic, because despite being at the start of my career, I was very adamant that I disagreed with that statement. Another thing that sort of stood out to me was sort of maybe a month or two after hearing that topic, I was actually allocated a young person who identified as both trans and identified as bisexual. And I found that actually I had no idea as a social work student how to actually navigate that conversation. Lastly, reflecting on my own experiences as an adolescent. So I felt really that support and information available to me was really limited. I never had conversations with any teachers working with me or anyone at any youth clubs. And so I felt that there was a massive gap in terms of thinking about how, as professionals, we did speak to young people about sexuality and gender. So thinking a little bit about my project now, I've sort of come into local authority. I've realised that this is what I wanted to look at. First step for me was looking a little bit about what the literature sort of says on the topic. So one of the key things that I sort of found out when reading was that a lot of health professionals felt that there were barriers to having conversations with young people around sexuality. So some of them felt that actually they would be a little bit embarrassed to have these conversations with young people. Some of them felt like actually it wasn't their responsibility to have these conversations with young people. You know, other professionals might do it, it might be their teachers, or maybe their parents would have these conversations with them. And for some people, they just felt like there was a lack of education. So they were just unsure about how to actually approach these conversations themselves, even if they sort of wanted to. Another thing that came up was that despite the fact that maybe we aren't having these conversations, there is a massive need for us to. So a study by Stonewall in 2017 said that 1 in 4 Black, Asian and minority ethnic people accessing social services felt that they'd experienced discrimination because of their gender identity and or their sexual orientation. So actually what we're seeing there is discrimination. It didn't sort of specify which social services, but potentially from social workers based on gender identity and sexual identity. Another thing that came up quite a lot as well is that conversations were only really taking place when it was felt like it was essential for a conversation to take place. So for example, if someone had maybe disclosed some form of sexual harm, then a conversation may come up. Or if someone had sort of mentioned a question around their gender identity, then a conversation may come up, but actually conversations weren't being initiated. Some more points that came up, sort of having a bit of a look at what the literature said, is that teaching around sort of questions around sexuality were actively avoided. So the source that I found was from 2009. So, you know, hoping that in this time since then, actually there has been significant change. But thinking about the fact that there are lots of social workers that would have sort of come through training and come through the system around this time, and it actually being felt that maybe it was a controversial topic to talk about sexuality. And that is something that I have still found when having some conversations with colleagues about sort of conversations about sexuality as well. So another thing that I found is that when it came to actually having conversations with people we work with about sexuality, it really reinforced to them that this was a big part of their lives, an important part of their lives. So it was very validating for a lot of people that we work with to have these conversations initiated with them. And then another thing that I found as well is that for social workers who do identify as queer and maybe haven't disclosed their sexual orientation, in some ways it can take away in some cases from the work that you're doing with young people, because it might be that you're thinking a lot about how am I presenting, do I sort of cover up who I am, is there something I'm allowed to say, is there something that I'm not allowed to say, and that can, I guess, take away from your presence in the moment. That is definitely something that I feel like I related to, particularly in these sort of early experiences that I was sort of speaking about that led to me picking this research topic. So about the research that I actually, so we did an action research dissertation. So my research was an action research project. I had a small sample study, as was the case with many of my other colleagues doing the master as well. And all of the young people were Gaelic competent, so they were able to sort of understand the information presented to them, take part. And the intervention took part in 3 different stages. So the first intervention that I did with them as part of this project was looking a little bit about their social graces, so thinking a bit about Burnham's different aspects of identity, and just sort of asking them a little bit about what identity markers for them really stood out as being prominent to who they are, and anywhere they actually felt like, if I am thinking about who I am, maybe this isn't one that I would sort of pick for myself or sort of pick as important to me. And through that, we were able to have a lot of conversations about the different aspects of identity, but we were also able to think a lot about sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender within those conversations too. The second activity that we did sort of focused on sexuality more widely, and we had sort of different words associated with relationships. So it was a sort of a mix of both healthy signs of relationships, maybe unhealthy signs of relationships, and things that were in the middle. So we had things like trust, honesty, respect. We also, on the other side, sort of had things like arguments, control. We were able to have some really open conversations then about relationships too. And then the last thing that I did was to get some feedback from the young people just about sort of how they found the activity and how they found sort of the process of being part of the project as well. So coming on a little bit to what I actually found from the presentation, there were quite a few findings that came out. Some of them were surprising to me. I would say others were not surprising to me. One of the first things that came out was that the young people told me that professionals didn't really have conversations with them about sexuality outside of school. When they did have the conversations in school, they were pretty basic. They didn't go into much detail. A lot of them were focused a bit more on sort of the biology, sort of anatomy of the body, the basics of sexual intercourse. Some did say that they'd had some conversations around consent, but they said that outside of that, there weren't really any conversations that were being had with them. One of them told me that a previous social worker had had some conversations with them about sexuality, but then when I asked a bit more, she said that that was me who had had that conversation with her, and none of the social workers that she'd worked with, of maybe about 4, had initiated those conversations with her. I think another thing that came up a lot when speaking with the young people as well, sort of as the research said, is that sexuality is only really mentioned if they were to sort of disclose something that was quite serious or in response to an incident. And that was sort of something that I guess it was a little bit of a worry, in the sense that, you know, if we sort of jump ahead to some of the findings later on, we found that there were some disclosures that were made as a result of us initiating these conversations. A big thing that came from the findings is that there was a gap in the knowledge of the young people. So there were conversations that we had regarding relationships around aspects of consent, around some of the law around sort of sexual activity. that they just didn't know. So, for example, it was quite a shock to a young person who I worked with who was part of this, who was 15, who wasn't aware that if somebody in his class of the same age had sort of shared a sexual image to him and he had it on his phone, that was still classed as having an indecent image of a minor on his phone. And that was something that was sort of very surprising to him, and not a conversation that anyone had ever sort of had with him before, despite the fact that we know that, you know, young people sending images to each other is something that's very prominent and is a very sort of serious issue. There were also a lot of gaps in the knowledge of social workers. So part of our research involved us having conversations with our peers. We had something called reflective teams where we'd sort of talk a little bit about our research, talk a little bit about how the project was going. And a lot of my colleagues just sort of said to me, you know, I don't know if I'd know how to have these conversations. I don't know if I would sort of know how to approach these young people when thinking about sexuality and gender. And that was something that was a bit of a concern as well. Speaking with young people, they did mention to me that they were a bit more comfortable talking with sort of aspects of their identity, such as race, because they felt like if they were to look at people and people were to look at them, something like their race might be a little bit more obvious. Whereas when it comes to thinking about sort of some of the hidden graces, potentially one of my young people who identified as bisexual said that actually she felt like that was something that she didn't really feel as comfortable talking up, because it's something she had to sort of think quite a lot about before disclosing to people. And I suppose that sort of links to the research when it came to sort of reflections about us as practitioners feeling that discomfort about disclosing aspects of our identity. Some other findings that came up as well. So for us to be able to have these conversations with young people, one thing that they did all unanimously tell me is it was really important that we had positive relationships with them, that those relationships had been built up prior to the conversations being initiated, because they felt that actually that created a safe space for them to be able to speak a bit about what was going on for them in terms of sexuality, in terms of what was going on with gender identity. As sort of previously touched on, having conversations with the young people about gender and sexuality can actually encourage disclosures. So one thing that I'd say was a bit of a surprise to me is that all of them made disclosures about sort of quite concerning situations that either themselves or their friends had been. So one made a disclosure about the parent of a friend being in an abusive relationship, and sort of initiated conversation with me about that after we began having a conversation. One young person made a disclosure about a party that she went to, and actually a situation where one of her friends hadn't given consent, and sort of someone was being very persistent with her friend. So what I was actually sort of wondering is, what is the impact for these young people where we haven't been able to initiate conversations around sexuality and gender identity? And is it possible that there were a lot of disclosures that maybe we haven't been able to get just because we maybe didn't start the conversations and we maybe waited for sort of someone else to come to us with the information? So the final couple of findings that I thought were sort of important and of note is that some young people found that if we were to disclose our sexualities or sexual orientations or gender identities, big asterisks here, I think it's about what you as a professional are comfortable with sharing. And I would definitely not encourage anyone to share any aspects of themselves that they are not completely comfortable with in work. But for some young people, knowing that they had a queer practitioner working with them was really good in sort of helping them to create the conversation. And I know a lot of people find that if, for example, they maybe have sort of a flag on their badge, on their lanyard, that has sometimes encouraged young people to initiate conversations with them, because they feel like actually this might be a bit of a safe space. But interestingly enough, a lot of young people, as I touched on in the beginning, feel like if we're not thinking about LGBTQ plus identities, actually, you know, there isn't anything for me to talk about in terms of sexuality. There isn't anything for me to talk about in terms of gender. As I said, even if you've got a young person who maybe identifies as heterosexual or maybe identifies as being cisgender, what we do have, or what the young person may have, they may still have sort of questions around what it is to be a man. They may still have questions around gender roles or their sort of position within society. So actually, it's important that these questions, these conversations that we have for our young people, we're not just focusing on LGBTQ plus young people. There may be specific needs that group of young people have, but actually this is something relevant to all of the young people that we are working with. So the last bit is sort of thinking a little bit about my approaches. So what do I do now? How have I incorporated some of this into my practice? So the first key thing is just not to make assumptions and to be curious. I've seen examples of maybe a young girl and a social worker has said, where's your boyfriend then? Without actually realizing that one of the key things going on for this young person currently is that they've identified as a lesbian, and that's causing issues within their family. That in itself sort of made the young person immediately just sort of shrivel up in their presentation, and created a bit of a barrier moving forward for how the young person interacted with us in the meeting. Educate yourselves and fill in the gaps. As I said, even for me, identifying as trans or bi or queer, there's a lot of knowledge and sort of information that I didn't have, and it's just important to take it upon yourself to where you can educate yourself as you do with other aspects of maybe identity and theory. Build effective working relationships with young people. So as I mentioned, they felt like they were only able to have this conversation if they had built the relationships with people and could trust the practitioners that they're working with. Be bold and initiate the conversations. That doesn't mean force conversations on young people that they may not be ready for. If they're not ready to have the conversations, then that is totally okay. But there may be ways that you can initiate conversations with young people, and then information that comes from that. Another thing that I've found it good to do with young people is to ask them what sort of language they would like me to use for them when discussing gender and sexuality. And if possible, as a queer practitioner, you feel able to identify and open up about your identity, that might be helpful too. So coming to the end, I've just got the 5-minute warning, but a few things that I've sort of say that may work. Gathering this information is part of your assessments. It's part of our a young person's, or hopefully you'd have a bit of a think about a young person's ethnic background, racial background, education, geographical background. Actually, this is part of a young person's identity, so something that we should be considering when we're doing sort of our general assessments. Thinking about using the social graces as a bit of an activity. So as I did within my study, one thing that sort of I really enjoy doing with the young people that I work with is having all of the graces out on different pieces of paper and asking them to pick the ones that they feel are really important to them and why, and maybe the ones that are not as important. And that can be really good in terms of establishing a relationship, and could maybe give them the chance to ask you any questions. So I get a lot, you look really young for a social worker, or why are you a social worker, or are you from the local area, sort of questions. And then the last couple of sort of things that I thought of as well is the gender unicorn, which I really like. It's called the gender unicorn, but it actually covers sexuality at the bottom as well. So that's a way that you can sort of explore how the young person identifies versus how they sort of present themselves in terms of their gender expression. You can then look a little bit about sort of sexual orientation at the bottom with the other questions, and it can be a good way to sort of have the young people dissect the different aspects of their gender and sexual identities. And then the last one is just sort of doing an activity with the young person around unpacking their different perceptions of gender. So what does it mean to you to be a man? What does it mean to you to be a woman? What does it mean to you to be non-binary? And then here's some just information that I've said to Marie that I'm happy to be shared, but there's just sort of a range of places that can be sort of accessed. A lot of people have more local resources, so I would encourage you to sort of look locally. But yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm aware we've only got 3 minutes left. We have one question so far, and that's from JP Seeley. And it says, do you think that different cultural values have had an impact on whether young people disclose?
Definitely. It definitely can do. So I have had young people, for example, say to me that they felt unable to disclose, maybe because of aspects of their culture. And this is why at the beginning I said intersectionality is so important. So your approach to working with one young person who, for example, might identify as gay may be very different depending on racial background, ethnic background, religious views, geographical location. Some might feel particularly unsafe in one area and might feel unable to express themselves in one area, whereas they may go to a different area and feel a lot more safe. I think the way that I approach it is just sort of having the conversation with the young person about what they are comfortable with, thinking a lot about whether or not they feel comfortable having conversations with parents. I've facilitated conversations between young people and parents before. I've also maybe been working with like a 16-year-old who said, actually, I'm not comfortable with my mum knowing. That's not an immediate safeguarding risk. And so we maybe held that till they felt able to. So it's a lot about sort of judging it on a case-by-case basis and definitely tailoring your approach to the other aspects of identity of the young person.
Okay, I'm keen to cut in because we've got two more questions, and the second question is about recommended reading. This is from Kiara Doran. It says, do you have any recommendations for reading, and are you willing to share your research project? Because they'd be very keen to read more. And I know that there are references and sort of links on the presentation which will be shared. So perhaps that answers that question. And then there's another question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I was saying, so there are some references there that can be accessed.
I suppose the question about your research, it's up to you. I mean, I'm not sure if it's been published yet or not.
Yeah, it hasn't. So what I'll probably do is have a chat with Frontline a little bit about that in terms of next steps in terms of sharing.
Cool. The question I really want to get in is it's a bit of a personal question, but it's from Charlie Bernard, and it says, how do you as a queer practitioner navigate conversations with parents who potentially have homophobic views which can be impacting their queer children?
Yes, I have had before, for example, a parent who has said that, you know, this young person didn't have this language before working with you, and actually the young person had come to me and said, I think I may be trans, or I think I may be bisexual. I think it is really difficult. You may work with parents who are homophobic. I sort of came into the profession also knowing that I may be working with parents who might be racist, and so in some ways I sort of approach it in a similar way in terms of these are aspects of my identity. These aspects of my identity, I feel, bring positive aspects to my practice. I'm very open. There was a lot for me of unpacking myself, a lot of internalized homophobia about actually, you know, me, is it wrong for me to have this as an identity marker that I share? And actually it took a lot for me to unpack that it's okay for me to say that I'm queer. It doesn't make me any less of a practitioner, and actually it has impacted positively some of the work that I do with young people. I think, as I said, I approach them in a really similar way. If I do have any challenging conversations with parents, I bring it to my supervision. I work within what feels safe for me. I'm lucky that I haven't had any sort of serious incidents of homophobia at work, which is positive, but very much just focused on the intervention of the young people, using the safe spaces that I have, the colleagues that I have to sort of talk about any issues that I do have. That's sort of how I've managed it so far.
Thank you so much. So we are 1 minute over. It's just left for me to say to Kasey, thank you so much. This is a very, very timely presentation because it's very much of the moment. People are navigating the very difficult thing, and we'd just like to thank you so much for sharing, and we'll get back to people about whether or not you're publishing or sharing your research.